Hello and welcome to our fourth video on historical bloodlines in Crusader Kings 2 Holy Fury. This time we will be looking at the bloodlines that disappear between 1066 and 1337, the first and final start dates of the base game. Before we get to the bloodlines though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the world in the year 1099, as that is the first start date that we will use for looking at some of the bloodlines that will disappear. There are a few changes between 1099 and 1066, so we want to go over the obvious ones. First of all, Rome. In the Anatolian lands we now have a new kingdom, or rather a new sultanate. This of course formed by the successful Seljuk invasion of the Byzantines. Next to Rome, much smaller, we have the Principality of Antioch. So we have our first Crusader king in Crusader Kings. Would have thought they're actually a thing in the game. Next to that, we have, of course, in Sicily again, Antioch, but also Sicily. The Houthis managed to conquer the Muslims, and now between Apulia and Sicily they control all of Sicily. Going further west, in Castile, we have one big kingdom where there used to be multiple, so that of course strengthens them a bit, since united it's a lot easier to fend off any aggressors. North from there, of course, Norman England, because, well, William the Conqueror took over England. No surprise there. And lastly, one thing I want to draw some attention to is this little kingdom, the kingdom of Sakya Trizin. Right now they don't amount to much, but we'll see them develop a bit. Sadly, Kuga and Uzang are no longer of the same dynasty, so my dreams of them uniting Tibet crushed. Thank you, history. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get to some actual bloodlines. Starting in India, we have here a interesting dynasty, Chalukya Chola. Last time we saw the Chola dynasty, and well, this being a different dynasty, they do not have the same bloodline. The bloodline does, however, still exist. If we take a look at them, we see 4 unlanded men. These 4 men will continue to survive for a little while longer, but on the 1st of January 1100 they will all disappear. So at this point there's not a lot of time left to save this bloodline. If you want to keep them in your game, you're going to have to try to at least get these men to get some children. If you want to start as a playable ruler with this bloodline, then you'll have to go all the way back to 1069 when we had the last king. However, in 1070, as seen, we have the current ruler of Tamilakam, who does not have this bloodline. Going to the opposite side of the world, in our Scotland we find Clydesdale, and there we have the blood of Caradoc as before. However, this man is 74 years old. He's not going to last a single day longer, at which point we only have these 3 Welsh people who continue the bloodline but without any land. That of course means that it's going to be a lot harder for the bloodline to stick around without the player helping them along, and that leads to eventually on the 1st of January 1105 there being only one of them left, and that is Nest, who at that point is a 50-year-old woman, so that basically makes it impossible to continue the bloodline, as she is very unlikely to have any children at that point. Going south to Valencia, we have of course Rodrigo de Vivar, also known as El Cid, and he has 2 daughters. He also had a son, but he died, so currently the bloodline consists out of the three of them. He himself will rule for a very short while longer. He will die on the 9th of July, at which point it's just his daughters with the bloodline, and that leads to the bloodline eventually going extinct at the start of 1112. Lastly, going east, we find that Hungary now rules over Croatia, which also means that the man we previously found as the Duke of Slavonia, Zvonimir, no longer has his dynasty ruling over Croatia, and in fact is unlanded. There is a princess remaining, so she could in theory matrilineally marry to continue the bloodline, but the bloodline is suffering quite badly at this time. If you want to play as the last playable ruler with the bloodline, you will have to start in 1088, as the last rule ends on the 1st of January 1089. The last possible date to see the bloodline is the end of 1116, but at that point this Princess of Croatia is 53 years old, so she is not going to continue the bloodline from that start. Moving forward in time a bit to the 11th of March 1138. Again, some small changes to the map. First of all, in the east, Sakya Trizin is now a much larger kingdom, controlling a significant chunk of Tibet. In the west, there is a kingdom of Sicily, now uniting the duchies of Apulia and Sicily. And of course, in the middle, there is the kingdom of Jerusalem. We now have two Crusader Kings in Crusader Kings 2. Southeast from there is the bloodline we'll actually be talking about. In Yemen, we have Sultana Ara of the Sulahid Sultanate. This is the last day on which you can play as her. And after that, there is sadly no playable ruler with her bloodline. Right now, there are 3 people. There's her and 2 of her children remaining. Her daughter will pass away not long after her. She will die on the 15th of February at age 63. Of course, at that age, or even at this age, there isn't any chance of her getting a child. Her son, at 43 years of age, has a bit of a better shot. However, the bloodline is a matrilineal inheritance bloodline. That means that if he is to pass on the bloodline, that means he is going to have to convert to a different religion that allows him to matrilineally marry, because right now he is a Shia Muslim. Of course, all of these things make continuing the bloodline a bit more complicated, so if you want to play with this bloodline, you're probably better off just starting at the start of when she comes to power in 1074, on the 10th of April, or even before that, and just try your best without directly controlling the bloodline at the start to get it to thrive. Moving forward a little bit, going from west to east. First of all, we see England controlling half of France. Next up, Sicily, controlling a decent chunk of the north coast of Africa. And then east from there, the Fatimids are now holding Mecca and Medina instead of the Seljuks. And further east to the bloodline we will be talking about, the Pala bloodline. They no longer control Bengal. They are still holding a kingdom tier title in the form of the Maharaja of Bihar. This is unfortunately the last date we can use to start as them, because if we start later, they will lose the 4 counties north of the Ganges River, which means that all of their land is controlled by vassals, and if that happens to you as the player, you get a game over screen because you no longer hold any land yourself. So they do still hold the kingdom title for 5 more years after this, but we cannot start as them. Eventually, of course, the bloodline will disappear entirely, and that will happen on the 1st of January 1174. At this moment though, they still exist, they still have a chance of surviving, a decent chance even, because we even have an heir who is 32 years old with the bloodline. So this is a fine time to try to revitalize the bloodline and get back the Bengal. Of course, you do need to first manage to get it out of the hands of a rather larger kingdom, so good luck if you wish to attempt this. Fast forwarding to 1180, we have a few changes to the map as well as a few plotlines I'd like to talk about, and we'll start with the changes to the map in the west. All the way in the west we have Ireland, now controlled half by England. Amusingly enough, it is the southern half that is controlled by England, the northern half of Ireland remains Irish. South from there, in the Iberian Peninsula, we have a bunch of Catholic kings, as Castile has spat out a Leon. South from there, in Africa, the western part is controlled by the Almohads, but east from there, Sicily has lost their North African shore. It is now controlled by the Ayyubids, who have replaced the Fatimids as sultans of Egypt. Previously, the great rival to the Fatimids was the Seljuk kingdom, and while the Seljuks do still hang around in Persia, they are greatly reduced in what they control. Going back a bit to the center of the Mediterranean, Venice has finally gotten off the island, holding 2 counties along the Gulf of Venice, and north from there on the Baltic shore instead we have a Denmark controlling some of the northern shores of the German/Polish lands. Going back east all the way into India we find the Ghaznavids. Once upon a time they ruled over a large portion of the Persian Empire, basically sharing it with the Seljuks, but they've been driven all the way into India by their fellow Turks, and well, they're not doing too well. Right now we have the Sultan of Punjab, Khusra II Malik of the Ghaznavid Sultanate, and he is the last remaining person with the bloodline of Sabuktigin, the Ghaznavid founder. He will rule over the Sultanate for a little while longer, until he finally dies on the 1st of January 1186, which is the end of this bloodline. Going back to Europe, we have the Duke of Gwent. He is the last male ruler with the blood of William the Conqueror. Right now, there are still a few other branches that have this bloodline. Eventually, they will all die out, with the last ruler being the youngest daughter of the current Duke William of Gwent, and she will rule over the duchy until she is 45 years old, at which point she will pass away, and that will be the end of the bloodline. The time in history that this happens, it's the 14th of October 1217. So if you want to have the very last possible start with the bloodline, that's the date you want to go for. Of course, since she is, as mentioned, 45 years old at that point, she might be a little bit too old to still have a chance of getting any children, so you'll probably want to start a little bit before then. At least she remains unmarried, so that does mean that you can just go find a matrilineal marriage and you should be fine. Then, on the other side of the channel, we find the Last of the Carolingians. Now, some of the people who are very knowledgeable of this game might know that the last playable ruler of the Carolingians can be found in Vermandois, but in fact the bloodline does continue for quite a while after that, and the final ruler will be the Prince Bishop of Verdun. He has the Carolingian blood, and of course his sisters have it as well. They are the last Carolingians, at least in terms of their bloodline. If you want to continue the bloodline from this date, you will of course have to make one of these sisters have a matrilineal marriage, so that she can continue the bloodline, hopefully with some children. If you want to have this man, Arnold, continue the bloodline, you can go back a few years. He will have this current Prince Bishopric in 1171. So if you start in 1170 or before then, you could just have him marry and continue the bloodline that way. After that, since he's a Prince Bishop, he is unable to marry, making it a lot more complicated for him to continue the bloodline. Of course, if you want to start with a ruler with the bloodline, you will have to go to Vermandois, and here we will find Adele, the last of the Carling blood, who loses her land on 1085 due to Meringhut, who will be the ruler in her name instead. The last male ruler is of course Herbert, who rules before Adele, and well, those are your options when it comes to playing as the Carlings in the base game. As for the final date on which this bloodline appears, you'll have to go a little bit further to 1197, at which point one of the sisters of the current Prince Bishop of Verdun is 54 years old, and well, that basically means the bloodline is doomed because she is not going to continue the bloodline at that age. So if you really don't want to see any Carlings, then the 1st of January 1198 is your option to not see the bloodline ever. Lastly, we are going to look at the 1st of January 1326 for one more bloodline that managed to make it from 1066 but not quite to 1337. Before we get to that bloodline though, let's take a look at the map. First of all, we have Mongols. Mongols everywhere. Mongols in the Golden Hordes, Mongols in Mongolia, Mongols in the Yuan Empire. A lot of Mongols in 1326. Within those Mongol realms though, there are some other people such as the Sakya-Trizin. He's controlling most of Tibet. South of Tibet we have the Tugluks. Those are Turks, not Mongols, so despite the poor performance of the Turkish bloodline we looked at last time, the Turks in general are doing alright. Of course, Turks are also to be found in modern-day Turkey, and the most powerful of them are the Ottomans. No real surprise there. Going west from there, we have a divided Sicily. Instead, we have the kingdoms of Naples and Trinakria. No more big kingdom of Sicily. And also further west, in Iberia, we have the Reconquista almost completed, with Portugal having basically its modern borders and Castile being almost all the way to the south, with only a little bit of Granada remaining to go. To the north, Ireland is now, instead of north and south, divided between west and east, and in the furthest north we have a big Norway. That is of course a united kingdom of Norway and Sweden. On the other side of the Baltic there is the Teutonic state, so hooray, we have a Teutonic order in this start date. But the bloodline we'll be looking at is not in any of these places. Instead it is in Hungary, or at least it used to be in Hungary, because this man, while having a bloodline, is not the one we're going to look at. Instead, if we go look at the history, we of course find some Arpad in the history, and this bloodline does still exist in a 70-year-old woman. Princess Arpad Erzsébet of Hungary, the last of the Arpads. She will die the very next day, and that will be the end of the Arpad bloodline. Of course, at this point it's way too late to try to save the bloodline. She is 70 years old, she is not going to have any children, even if you manage to matrilineally marry her at this date. If you want to have a more realistic opportunity of continuing the bloodline, you can find the last Arpad king in 1301 on the 13th of January. With all the bloodlines from 1066 that go extinct before 1337 out of the way. Let's look at some of the new bloodlines that appear after 1066 but disappear before 1337. For this, we are going to head back to 1151, and on the 31st of December we have the very last day on which we have an Almoravid. Current Almoravid is the Emir Yahya of Fez, and he of course has the blood of Yusuf, the Almoravid that managed to get a bloodline. This bloodline was founded on the 1st of January 1071 and, well, as mentioned, disappears the day after the current date, so the 1st of January 1152. As for what it does, as you can see, it gives a monthly piety bonus, showing that that's not just reserved for Arwa, and an Andalusian opinion bonus in addition to the usual personal combat skill. Now, the Andalusian opinion bonus is a bit interesting. As you can see, this Emir is Berber and so is Yusuf. However, the Almoravids used to rule over not just the Maghreb, but also a lot of southern Iberia, and there they will of course have had a lot of Andalusian vassals. So if you start at an earlier date, then you will have those Andalusian vassals, and that makes the plotline actually useful. We look at the history of the Sultanate of Maghreb. You can look at some of the dates where you have various kings and when the last king stopped having his land, and that would be Ishak, who loses the kingdom title in 1147 to the current Sultan Abd al-Mumin of the Almohad dynasty. So if you want to have a decent shot of continuing this bloodline, maybe start a bit earlier, like for example during the rule of Ishak. Going north, in Navarra, we have another new bloodline. This time it is the blood of Garcia the Restorer, founded on the 27th of September 1134, and this one will continue to exist until the 1st of January 1235. This is a very standard bloodline, giving a monthly prestige and personal combat skill bonus, and a Basque opinion bonus, which is of course the culture that we find in Navarra and basically nowhere else. So that makes the actual use for this bloodline somewhat limited. Going east to Sicily, we find the first of the two Holy bloodlines. This one being the blood of King Roger of Sicily, the current ruler of the kingdom. His bloodline gives a monthly prestige, personal combat skill and Latin opinion bonus. Latin of course being the culture group that Normans are a part of. Aside from Normans, there is also the Italians, the Occitan and the French that get a bonus, as well as the newly added Dalmatians. Aside from that, keep in mind that even though English is not in that culture group, the current rulers of England are Norman, so they will like you more for your bloodline. The bloodline itself was founded on the 25th of December 1130 and will continue to exist until the 1st of January 1247, at which point the last member of the bloodline passes away. However, as she is a 55-year-old woman, she is unlikely to continue the bloodline even if you start a few days earlier. Furthermore, she is unlanded, so you can't start as her. If you want to start with the bloodline, you'll have to go back to 1242, though at that point the last ruler of the bloodline is the Countess of Lecce, and she is also 55 years old, so you might want to start a decade or so earlier, though at that point you can even choose to play as the Count of Girgenti, who is the last male ruler who rules until 1232. And finally, further east in Antioch, we have the second Holy bloodline, this time that of Bohemond. Again, a monthly prestige and personal combat skill bonus, and a special effect of having a higher chance to create Crusader states. What this means is that if you play as them and you participate in a crusade and you occupy some land outside of the crusade target, then there is a chance for you to create a separate Crusader state for an unlanded family member or your beneficiary. So, for example, say a crusade has been called for Egypt and you manage to occupy some land in Africa outside of the de jure territory of Egypt, then that land could, in theory, go to your family members with a higher chance than normal due to your bloodline. Pretty cool. Moving on to 1204, in the Latin Empire start date, we have a lot of new bloodlines. Of course, most of them relating to the Third or Fourth Crusade. Starting with the character I have selected, we have Emperor Baudouin of the Latin Empire. He of course has the blood of Baudouin himself, giving a Latin opinion bonus and monthly prestige, but a Byzantine opinion penalty. So that is the first negative effect in a historical bloodline. Aside from that, it also lets him castrate and blind people, so he can blend in with the Byzantines, except for the fact that everyone amongst the Byzantines can tell that he's somebody they don't like. Anyway, the bloodline was founded on the 16th of May 1204, of course, because of the whole Latin Empire thing, and it will continue to exist until the 2nd of October 1280, at which point a 78-year-old woman will be the last person to die with this bloodline. Of course, that's not a great point to continue the bloodline from, so if you want to have a better chance of continuing to play with this bloodline, then you are going to want to start quite a bit earlier. Also, of the Fourth Crusade, there is the blood of Dandolo. The blood of Enrico gives a Byzantine opinion penalty as well, because of the same reason. They didn't quite take kindly to the whole Crusaders taking Constantinople thing. And as for the positive effect of his bloodline, there is the city vassal opinion, because of course the Serene Doge that is that famous would get the admiration of fellow mayors. Going to the Third Crusade, we have the blood of Friedrich, also known as Barbarossa. He gets a plus 0.2 monthly prestige bonus, but aside from that, it is a very standard bloodline, giving the German opinion bonus, that is of course the culture that he has, and a personal combat skill bonus. It was founded on 1st of January 1152, and it will continue to exist until the 31st of October 1318, although the last ruler with this bloodline dies on the 29th of October 1268. Continuing on to England, we go take a look at the history. There is Richard the Lionheart. He of course has his own bloodline as well, with a monthly piety bonus and a Catholic opinion bonus, because he's just that great a Catholic. He also has the blood of Alienor. However, as her bloodline continues to exist until 1337, we will take a closer look at that one in our next video. It's not yet time for that though. We do have more bloodlines in this date to look at, and the next one will be on the other side of the Crusades, the famous Muslim Sultan Saladin. His bloodline can be found in the Emir of Jerusalem, as well as his siblings and of course their offspring, though not the current Sultan of Egypt, as that was a brother to Saladin and a uncle to these current rulers. As for the bloodline itself, it was founded on the 2nd of October 1187 and continues to exist until the 1st of January 1295, though at that point it has already become unlanded. The last ruler with the blood of Saladin ends his reign on the 1st of January 1260 in Damascus, so you will have to start at least before then if you want to see this bloodline with some land of its own, unless it happens to somehow manage to get back some land after that date. As for the bonuses, it has a morale defense bonus, a Muslim opinion bonus, and a monthly prestige. The monthly prestige is fairly default. The morale defense is nice to give a little bit of combat abilities to your actual armies, and the Muslim opinion bonus is amazing because, well, there are a lot of Muslims in the world, and you're going to interact with a lot of them most likely if you have this bloodline. And of course it makes a lot of sense that the Blood of Saladin gives these bonuses, as the morale defense of course comes into play with all the fighting that Saladin did against the Crusaders, and the Muslim opinion bonus is very reasonable, what with it being a pretty significant thing that Saladin did in battling the Crusaders and leading the Muslim campaign against them. And lastly, for this particular date, in the West, at the Almohads, they now too have their own bloodline due to halting the Reconquista. Their bloodline is a very standard one, giving the usual prestige, personal combat skill, and their own culture's opinion bonus. The bloodline was founded on the 29th of July 1184 and continues to exist until the 1st of January 1269. And that is it for the bloodlines in this start date, but there are two more bloodlines remaining to talk about in this video. For our last two bloodlines, we go to 1271, when we already find Mongols in Asia. Of course, these Mongols are part of the reason why there is a bloodline, and that bloodline is the blood of Baibars, the current Sultan of Egypt. He got his bloodline for defeating the Mongols and also removing Crusader states. Right now there are still some Crusader states, but they aren't looking too great, and with a realm like this he'll have no trouble removing them entirely. And his bloodline is unfortunately again a very standard one, giving prestige, personal combat skill, and an Egyptian opinion bonus, and he is of course Egyptian himself. As for the bloodline, it was founded in the 21st of October 1260 and continues to exist until the 1st of January 1290, though they lose their land in 1279 in July. So if you want to play as them, you will have to pick a date before then. And lastly, for this video's special super secret bloodline, we have to find a character that does not hold any land, and his name is William Wallace. William Wallace, of course, has the blood of William, and it gives a morale defense bonus, a personal combat skill bonus of +8, so a bit higher than the usual, and a Scottish opinion bonus. All in all, it's a fairly decent bloodline. However, as mentioned, he does not hold any land in any start date, so you will have to land him manually if you want to see the blood of William Wallace accomplish anything by themselves. And that is it for all the bloodlines in this video. If you only wanted to hear about the bloodlines, then now is a fine time to stop watching. If you want to hear me ramble on for a little bit longer, then I can do so. There are a few things that I figured I'd mention. As you might have noticed, there are some actual different thumbnails on the videos now. Initially, when I made the first video, I expected to have maybe about 20 views, so I didn't really put too much effort into the thumbnail because I figured nobody would see it anyway. As there have been a few views more than that, I felt obliged to put a little bit more effort into it. Of course, it does remain a small amount of effort, as I didn't want to suddenly change the thumbnail so much that it's completely unrecognizable, though I do plan to actually put in a slightly more interesting thumbnail in videos of anything past this little series. And yeah, that's about it for extra things I figured I'd mention. So, with that said, take care, have fun, and enjoy playing around with all these bloodlines. And I hope you'll be back next time for the final episode of this little series. Until then, goodbye.